Well, hello. I hope you are doing well. I am sorry I'm not with you in person this week, but I thought it would be easiest for a variety of reasons for me to record um, effectively a very long lecture for us this week. I held an afternoon seminar course earlier this week from home, and I had several interruptions to our Zoom session, and that was my primary motivation for just recording our conversation regarding this week's readings. And this is the posting that summarizes my comments on your readings for this week. As a bit of a background, I know that you can walk through the PowerPoints on your own. I'm not going to go through each slide as carefully as I might have done so if we were talking together in person. I also want to draw to your attention, I've posted several short video links that complement some of the readings, and I'll try to remember to point out what they are and why they're particularly helpful as they align with some of the chapters for this week. So, taken together, the readings for this week include the voices of some contemporary scholars who aspire to explain or account for um, poverty in the United States. There are a lot of different ways we can approach this. In essence, maybe we're asking a series of specific questions, such as why are the poor poor? But it's the same question we would ask if we were to say, why are the middle class in the middle class? Why are those in the upper tier, the upper classes, where they are? There's really no straightforward answer. Um, there's some clear variables and contributions, and we're going to address many of those, but not all of them. But before we do, I wanted to mention to you what I think is a helpful framework for thinking about the nature of these influences with regard to explaining why people are where they are in the social class stratification system. And it's called the social world model. And it's depicted on the right hand side of the slide. And you can see it's like there are different layers that surround us or people groups at any given time, and they operate as areas of influence. If you we put ourselves in the middle, we can see that we're most directly affected at any given time by those who are in our inner circle or who are closest to us. We're certainly shaped by the distinct characteristics of our neighborhoods, our local organizations and communities. Same could be said for each layer extending out further away from us. So the scholars whose voices you're introduced to in this week's readings don't necessarily disagree on what are the primary contributions to why we have um, as much poverty as we have. Why do we have the configuration of social groups in the poverty class overrepresented or underrepresented compared with what we see in other class categories? I would say a better way of putting it is to say that they just emphasize different contributing variables to poverty status. We can group accounts for social class position. We can also group today's readings in terms of whether or not they address what we call micro level influences, meso level influences, or more macro level influences. There are a couple of the readings today that I think, in terms of the things that they address, they actually touch on all three, or or some combination of two of these levels of influence. Each level is important. Each level adds an important degree of insight concerning social behaviors and outcomes. And so we're going to walk through the readings and just keep in mind kind of the area of focus associated with each scholar. What you see here is a listing or a grouping of some of the articles according to how I would organize them in terms of their focus. For example, reading 22 um, by Wilson, called Being Poor, Black, and American. I think Wilson addresses some important contributing factors at the micro level of life, but also at the meso level of social life, and definitely at the macro level of social life. And so you can just see for yourself how the different articles are situated and the ones that seem to represent their ideas um, across these particular groupings. I'd like to talk first about the readings associated with William Julius Wilson. Wilson is a scholar. I think he's currently based at Harvard University. He's a sociologist interested in racial inequality, um, that which is extreme, that which is evidenced in inner city urban areas in the United States. Wilson is the former president of the American Sociological Association. He's a scholar of race and ethnicity and urban sociology, and he is known for many groundbreaking works, one of which is the book that these two chapters come from. One of the things that I want to draw your attention to is a pair of opening vignettes that he starts with. He opens by sharing some personal stories concerning his own experiences with race and racism as an African American scholar. One of those vignettes opens in the following way. He says, I am an internationally known Harvard professor. However, I too would tense up when I walked my dog at night and saw a black man or a group of black male teenagers approaching me on the street. He also talks about a situation in which he's in an elevator going up to his home in Cambridge, and how an older white couple tensed up when they saw him on the elevator because they didn't know who he was. All they saw was an adult black male that they didn't recognize on their residential elevator. So his goal in this larger work that these chapters come from, the larger work called More Than Just Race, is to make a significant contribution to how we understand not just social inequality, but racial inequality in particular. And he's also particularly interested in what he calls the goings on within the underclass in the United States. Um, Racial minorities who live in poverty in very dense areas in the inner city in most of our good sized cities in the United States. He wants us to have an appreciation for how complex the contributing variables are, and he is nudging social scientists quite strongly to reconsider their understanding of the role played by social structure and culture in shaping poverty among the underclass. I think probably one, if I could summarize in a sentence or two his primary message, he would say that sociologists and other social scientists have yet to take culture seriously when they seek to explain this facet of racial social inequality. Um, that it is, by that he means it's a significant contributing factor to the status of racial minorities in these inner city areas. He would also argue that while culture is a shaping influence and force, it is not a more important or more influential force relative to social structure. Social structure includes a lot of things, but at minimum, it includes the opportunity structure and built environment that shapes the life chances and life choices of people in these areas. So he is, in his writing, representing a sharp departure from the opinion of most social scientists, and that Wilson says that both things, cultural forces and social structure, are relevant. And until we grasp that reality, he says, we'll have a difficult time of addressing great social disparities. The figure that I have on the right here is just a simple depiction of some of the things that are included in that notion of culture, how we differ in our own groups from others in terms of the nature and types of the relationships we form, how we live our lives in our homes and our houses, the types of jobs we have, the educational aspirations that define us and that characterize us, the types of fashions we identify with, and so on and so forth. So he's very much a proponent of acknowledging the important role of culture. And this is very much referenced throughout this particular chapter. So the cultural forces that he thinks are relevant, the cultural forces that he says are indicated in a variety of studies that he references. They operate at two levels, one at the national or macro level, and others at the micro level of social life. And we'll talk about examples of each of these. So some terms to keep in mind as we walk through this are listed on the screen for you. He introduces us to the notion of a cultural frame, what is meant by the code of the street, the code of shady dealings, job spatial mismatches, subculture of defeatism, and subculture of resistance. I'm not going to go through all of those, but a selection of those things. Cultural frames, according to Wilson, represent, as indicated here, background ideologies that uh, are broadly understood. They're shared visions of human behaviors. We have background ideologies about all sorts of groups of people. They relate to children. You know, what are children like? What are their general characteristics? In general, do we have, and we do have ideologies according that link to gender, notions about what are poor people like, and so on and so forth. These are particularly important because he says these things called cultural frames, as they relate to racial categories, function as a type of social constraint when we interact with other people. He explicitly says that racism is a macro level cultural frame that has long-term negative impacts on Blacks and African Americans in the United States. And he goes on to specify how cultural frames operate. He talks about this notion called the code of the street. The code of the street is a characteristic of a statistical minority in the types of urban areas that Wilson has studied for the better part of his career. The code of the street is a phrase coined by sociologist Elijah Anderson and described and discussed in his larger work called The Code of the Street, Decency, Violence, and the Moral Life of the Inner City. This particular phenomena is paired with about a 6-minute video that I've provided for you under week 4 in modules, and it features Elijah Anderson describing in some detail what he means by this cultural characteristic. In short, he's referring to the elevation or greater presence of this cultural characteristic as we see civil law diminishing in certain areas of urban areas. In general, he would say that it reflects the role of the need for people's respect, and it plays a part in elevated crime rates in these same areas. He says it's a form of social exchange. If we were to use another phrase to describe what he means by the code of the street, he would say it represents an oppositional culture that some living in these communities, they develop, they refine it, they live it, they project it, and they expect those around them to adhere to the requirements of this thing he calls the cultural code. He does his research that leads to the identification of this cultural pattern by doing an ethnography in some neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And at the core of this cultural characteristic, he says, is respect. He says, people who have developed what he calls the code of the street have developed a fairly sophisticated set of norms and practices that, taken together, um, enable them to be treated what they would call the right way, and position them to be treated with appropriate deference that they require in interpersonal interactions. And so the code of the street is a cultural characteristic. He says what stands out about the elements of the code um, have to do with how people who live by the code, who embrace the code of the street, they carry with them or display a certain presentation of self, and have a very low tolerance for what they would call being disrespected. The code is what he calls a framework for negotiating respect in dealing with other people. And when you read the specifics about what the code of the street requires, you might start thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, this sounds like some of the specifics that may characterize some types of gang interactions. And that's actually what this has to do with. Um, Elijah Anderson says that everyone living in these neighborhoods is well versed in the code of the street. Using his words, he talks about these neighborhoods consisting of different types of household units, and they self-label themselves as decent versus street families. While everyone is familiar with the code, only a statistical minority actually embrace it and enforce the code of the street, but others, the statistical majority, understand it, and they just try to acknowledge their awareness of this set of social norms as they navigate in day-to-day life. So I do encourage you to watch that short clip. I think you'll get a better working knowledge of this particular cultural characteristic, and one of the reasons why this characteristic is a contributing variable to social inequities for people living in this context is that, taken together, the rules that people live by actually, I'm trying to think of the different ways he would express it, um, are very alienating to other people, um, sometimes very frightening, um, and um, and they're very, some of the rules are very specific and precise, and he uses the word petty to outsiders, but the sanctions associated with um, lack of adherence to these rules can be to be very detrimental, if not life threatening. And so he says those who live by the code of the street position themselves to be living in an oppositional way relative to mainstream culture. In this same context, Wilson talks about another kind of macro level cultural characteristic, another macro level cultural frame that's associated with two other sociologists. It's called laissez-faire racism. This is a type of racial bias that he says tends to characterize some white Americans who, in essence, blame racial minorities for their poor economic status and view their economic status as a result of their cultural inferiorities. In other words, that they would say that, well, racial minorities on the average don't fare as well, largely because they have cultural habits, ways of living. Think code of the street, think of Vin Katesh's additional insights about that. And because of those cultural qualities, they are where they are in the social economic ladder. Examples of that would be attitudes that other um, um, groups living in these communities with phrases like, well, they have too many children, or they have a present day orientation, or they use drugs, and that's a significant part of their problem. And so that's taken together what he means by this notion of laissez-faire racism. Venkatesh is another sociologist. He's associated with the University of Chicago Department of Sociology, and his work done in a similar context, different geographical location, just adds another dimension to our understanding of some um, aspects of social life in these large scale, highly disadvantaged urban areas. And he describes something he calls the code of shady dealings. I forgot what page it is what page this is on in your reading, but it is described as a social pattern in response to job opportunities in impoverished inner city neighborhoods. So, somewhere in his conversation, Wilson kind of provides a narrative that aligns with this visual here. How is it that some of these cultural elements we just mentioned serve in effect to reinforce social inequalities? And it's a very simple visual, but he would argue that where we have the development of what he calls the code of the street, and this code of the street emerges in distinct social structural locations where there is vast, widespread a truncation of social opportunities. Um, it contributes to negative feelings toward urban Black males in particular, which enhances the sense of hopelessness and alienation for those very same subgroups, which reinforces the existence of the code of the street. The code of the street is described by Wilson here and in a couple other writings of his as, in many ways, a normal human response to the need to be regarded and valued for assets and characteristics that other people value. And they are taken together a creative response to the lack of objective opportunities to obtain regard in those neighborhoods. I mentioned that Wilson would argue that the social structural environment in which people live is more important in shaping people's um, life chances and life choices. And that's what I mean by that notion of structure surpasses culture and causal accounts of social inequality. The types that he thinks are most important, he would say concentrated disadvantage of the type that we've been talking about, and a lack of attachment to mainstream social institutions. Wilson would argue where you see people who um, have different marriage patterns relative to what we see in the general population. When I say different, I mean lower rates of marriage. That is due in part to the truncated opportunity ladder, which affects people's views of potential mates. We'd call it the marriageability of people. Lack of attachment to mainstream social institutions may also be seen in educational systems that Wilson would say are failing our young people. I mentioned a particular educational scholar, Jonathan Kozel, who's written a lot of things about that, his most well-known work called Savage Inequalities. The next block of things that I wanted to mention, and they're kind of taken together and taken from a larger work by, what an interesting combination, a former sociologist, now Jesuit priest named Jay McLeod. In 1987, Jay McLeod published the first version of, I think, a work that wound up going through 3 different editions because he was adding data. He published a book called Ain't No Making It. And I've published another short, well, relatively short, but longer than the other 2 video that introduces you to him and his larger work. Your readings for today come from a chapter, just one chapter in that work, where he lays out the theoretical argument for what he saw when he spent a significant period of time engaged in participant observation in a community in Camden, New Jersey. In his work, he Let me back up a minute. Let me just focus on this chapter. So these theorists that are covered in this chapter are the mini versions of theories associated with um, explanations that we would call social reproduction theories. How is it that we socially reproduce ourselves in the class system? So that if you are born into a lower um, class household neighborhood, what is it about that context that we can say socially reproduces itself, um, or we could say what is it about that type of household setting that increases the odds that those growing up in those households will not venture too far from a class position perspective from their starting point. These theorists, called social reproduction theorists, point to things in our educational systems, things in our linguistic patterns, um, things that we know that we would call cultural capital that taken together um, tend to replicate the class system. So McLeod, as a college student, working several summers in a row in some type of summer program in Camden, New Jersey, became very drawn to the need to look in a systematic way about the look at the occupational aspirations of of youth living in the same types of communities that Wilson was interested in studying, highly disadvantaged um, urban communities, and was particularly interested in young people's occupational aspirations, in part because he believes those were the most um, influenced by their cultural and social structural surroundings. So, a little bit about what hooked him into doing this study that led him to believe that in the relevance of social reproduction theories for understanding um, our placement in the class system. So he opens his work by acknowledging that in our society we tend to tell our kids they can be anything they want when they grow up, and you can be anything you want in part because our educational system is a great equalizer. It gives everyone the opportunity um, to be introduced to and master a sufficient amount of material so they can move on and aspire to the American dream, whatever one considers that to be. But McLeod was particularly blown away by his encounter with a young kid in this after school and summer camp program who gave him an answer to a question he never expected. He was asking the kid, what do you think you want to do when you grow up? Do you want to go to college? And the kid says to him, and this is an 11-year-old, he says, I am going to college. Who wants to go? I just end up getting a shitty job anyway. And he was amazed at the incredibly leveled aspirations that someone as young as an 11-year-old might have. And he wanted to explore, in part, whether or not different aspirations had different objective consequences down the road. So, as he explains in that short video I posted for you, he winds up doing participant observation. He himself was a young adult male, and he winds up hanging out with two groups of boys in this neighborhood. One he nicknames the hallway hangers. I don't know, it's a group of about 10 or 15 white youth, and the other group he nicknames the brothers. With one exception, they're all Black and African American. He learns about their daily lives, their families, what their hopes and dreams are, and they were very different. And the hallway hangers, these were guys who really didn't have many aspirations. They had a very weak um, attachment to school. They didn't like it. They didn't go. Um, if you were to ask them, what are you going to be like in 10 years? They'd probably say, I'll probably be dead or in prison or something along those lines. But the brothers, they were living in the same neighborhoods. They'd been living in those projects for about the same amount of time with their families. They had very different aspirations. They thought, school would be their ticket out and their ticket up. They had different specific ideas about what they wanted to be when they grew up. On the average, some people might use the phrase they were better kids. They tried not to get into trouble. They weren't into drugs. Some of them, when they could, they participated in after school activities. The important thing about these two groups, in part, is one, their characteristics kind of burst most people's accounts of not just youth groups, but also um, social inequality patterns when people have different aspirations for themselves. So, what follows is just a short summary and mention of some of the social reproduction theorists that McLeod references for the relevance of their insights in explaining the long-term outcomes that he tracks in these young men. These young men, he meets them in their mid to late teens, and he follows them into their early 40s, which is quite remarkable. The first reproduction theorist he tells us about are Bowles and Gentis, and essentially, Bowles and Gentis argue that the educational system in the United States itself actually helps track kids um, and nudge them in the direction um, that they anticipate based on their origins, their household social class. So that if a kid is from the lower or working class, they would argue that schools ultimately create and move kids in certain types of programs where they think those kids will graduate and wind up in jobs and leaving them in similar situations relative to their origins. Um, he would argue that the curriculum associated with different, we'll call them school tracks or pathways, have an important hidden curriculum that promote core values and attitudes linked to the demands of a capitalist society. For example, they will teach kids to be motivated by rewards, not the intrinsic value of learning, or flip that. That would be more characteristic of the hidden curriculum associated with the pathway where you'll find more middle class and upper class system in our schools. Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist, and his most important contribution to understanding how social inequality is reproduced. He talks about this thing called cultural capital. I have another link that gives you some examples of what of the cultural capital of a particular group, not a special group, but just a group that was featured in a larger PBS production called People Like Us. This features some people who are members of a group, we'd call them WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and it depicts just a series of things that we would say, people know these things. If you're a WASP, you know what word to use to refer to the fabric that's draped around a window treatment. Do you call them curtains or do you call them drapes? And so that's why he says cultural capital is particularly important as a contributing factor to our social position. And in the context of schools, he says the cultural capital of the dominant classes in particular, is what is valued and rewarded in the context of the school system. And so youth who don't have the cultural capital of the middle class or the upper class feel themselves on the fringes of where they would like to be in the educational system. So he talks about the school as being a trading post, a place where cultural capital possessions are traded or parlayed into academic success. His notion of habitus is equally important as well. Think of this as kind of an invisible force field surrounding you everywhere you go. in the earlier years of the life course, and it provides you with the background of ideas and notions about, well, just what do people do at my age or in the next age group. And it refers to a way in which we acquire our attitudes and aspirations with regard to all areas of life. And this too is an important distinguishing and influential cultural feature. Bernstein and Bryce, their linguistic cultural capital theory is kind of the most nitpicky and specific in terms of how they argue our class position is reproduced. And I'm just not going to walk through the details of this with you. And I'm going to try to give you the super duper short version and explain what you see in the series and explain what you will see in the series of slides that I have here. In essence, they argue that our class position is related to different forms of speech patterns, and those speech patterns are acquired in our home of origin. Once we get to school, some speech patterns are valued and highly regarded, more so than our others. Restricted code speech patterns are more devalued in the context of the school system compared with what they call elaborated linguistic speech patterns and codes. These are associated with middle and upper class backgrounds. And he says that people who are well versed in the former restricted codes are more likely to have challenges in their efforts for upward social mobility. They define these codes as causal agents shaping social inequalities because they align with valued forms of expression. These are some examples of those two types of codes. Told you I was going to zip through that. Meso-level influences on social inequality. Reading number 24, in essence, inequality makes us sick. We could spend an entire semester on this. It makes us sick in a variety of ways. Economic inequality makes us sick. Racial inequality makes us sick. Net of everything else that happened to us, we know that day-to-day experiences with racism chips away at our physical and mental health. This particular piece focuses on how our physical health is diminished by virtue of a greater exposure, say, to hazardous substances, things in our diets, how our cognitive abilities are affected by living in chronic poverty. The next piece is valuable because it focuses on more meso-level issues. Residential segregation is a particularly important contribution to social inequality. The gist of this article is that residential segregation is a chronic problem characterizing U.S. patterns of residence. In fact, some would argue it's worse than it used to be. On page 42, there's an important quote. Yeah, it's race is part of residential segregation systematically undermines the social and economic well-being of racial minorities. And I've included a couple charts for you to view and digest to kind of reinforce that particular point. This chart gives us information on the racial and ethnic composition of typical neighborhoods of different groups in metro areas and gives you a sense of change over time. For example, a neighborhood for the average white person around, say, 2018, 71% of all whites lived around other white people. Moving over to the right, we would say that you could see how that varied for people who are Black and their typical neighborhoods. In their neighborhoods, about 31% of residents would be white, about 45% would be Black, 17% would be Hispanic or Latino, and so forth. So we see that whites are more likely to live around whites, Blacks are more likely to live around Blacks, and Hispanics and Latinos are likely to live around people who are like them as well. So a lot of racial and ethnic residential segregation. This chart shows some additional important information with implications for social inequality. And it shows how, to what degree, low income people live in low income neighborhoods. So let's look here. Let's look at whites. Whites shows us that about 10% of all whites live in poverty. And it shows us that about half of whites who are low income live in low income neighborhoods. Let's move over to the right. About 24% of all people who are Black live in poverty. In addition to that, we can see that approximately 80% of Black people who are low income also live in low income communities. Living in low income communities has important um, correlates with things that affect our chances for upward social mobility. Those sorts of things are unpacked in the Owens and Sampson article, where they talk about neighborhood disadvantage and the specific characteristics we gauge to talk about neighborhood disadvantage and how it affects a variety of things that are relevant. One of the last pieces here, some of the last pieces, we're going to build on this in our larger reading, a work by Desmond. We're going to read his larger work called Eviction. Eviction is framed as a cause of poverty in this article and in his larger work. And one of the things that's largely underappreciated has to do with how many people qualify, low-income people qualify for housing assistance, how many people spend far too much money on their housing. The people who spend too large of a fraction of their income on housing are far more likely to be poor, and having an appreciation for how eviction rates have gone up in recent years. Some of the last things we're going to focus on will be the relationship between incarceration and social inequality. This really kind of has a circular relationship. Poverty may cause or increase the risk of incarceration, but being incarcerated also significantly affects one's risk for poverty upon release or reentry. What we know about incarceration, as a bit of background, we know that what we see in the United States is unprecedented in global history. We see and have seen the highest levels of incarceration in the United States that we've ever seen. And we have the highest levels of incarceration compared with all other countries. A not so fun fact, the United States has about 5% of the global general population, but we also have just about a fifth of the global prisoner population. Of all people who are incarcerated, we have about 23% of them in the United States. Estimates are that about 1 in every 100 adults in the United States at any given time, they are in prison or they are in jail. Most of them leave prison or jail. Each year, a little over 600,000 are released. And so that risk that incarceration imposes on one's economic well-being are realized by a lot of people each year. The three things coming out of Western's article would be that have to do with the nature of the social inequalities produced by mass incarceration. Western says they're sizable and they're enduring for three reasons. Number one, they are invisible. Number two, the impacts of incarceration are cumulative. And three, the impacts of incarceration are intergenerational. A couple of things about those few points. In this infographic, you can see some historical trends in rates of incarceration over time in the United States. This graph ends at around 2009, but the red line keeps going up, and that is the rate uh, of prison population in the United States. And we can see it blew up in the mid 70s and 80s with the war on drugs. What we know didn't happen during that time period was a crazy explosion just merely in the commission of crimes, but it had everything to do with the war on drugs, three strikes you're out, and a series of large scale pieces of federal legislation. Um, we mentioned, Western mentions that uh, inequality is linked to incarceration and it's invisible. We know that people who are incarcerated are literally segregated from the rest of the population. We typically find those institutions out of sight. We know that they typically are not counted in ways that might make sense. They're not part of our economic indicators. For example, they're not included in our unemployment rates. We know that that incarceration and its impacts are cumulative when we look at particularly lengthy sentences and how that affects people's not just cultural capital, you now know what that is, but also their cultural capital. For each year that you remain incarcerated, the cultural capital that you have diminishes, but so do the social ties you have, the social capital that you have that can serve as an important asset on the market. This chapter mentions the results of negative perceptions of people who are returned citizens and how that affects your prospects for getting a callback in job applications. Lastly, Western mentions the impacts of incarceration across generations, and they're particularly problematic. It's not just the people who are incarcerated that are directly affected, but their families are affected in the short term and in the long term. We know that families incur a hit to their household income, often um, as high as 22%. In the short term, 22% loss in household income on the average. Um, and we know that those experiences are not equally distributed across households based on racial composition on the household. This particular chart gives some information from the Prison Policy Initiative. I would highly recommend that website for sources of information having to do with incarceration experiences and prison policies in general. If you'll take a moment and look at this chart, it gives us information on, for example, the percentage of people in this study who report um, um, feeling like their physical health was thriving, and how answers to that varied by virtue of how many of their family members were incarcerated. So this green bar here represents the percentage of people saying they felt like their physical health was thriving, and these people had no family members who were currently incarcerated. And compare that with answers given by people who had three or more immediate family members who were incarcerated. Um, Probably around 26% said they felt like their physical health was thriving, compared with a much higher percent of those who had no family members who were incarcerated. And you can read the bars on the other side of that chart in the same way. So that was a super long overview um, of some of the readings that you were responsible for today. Um, I apologize if it seemed really long-winded, but I thought it was just best to get through that in one recorded session. Thank you for your time. Thank you for following up with this short overview by going back to Canvas and modules, and at your convenience between now and next week, listening to those videos and thinking about some of the content of the readings that relate to the material that's covered. So thanks again. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next week in Evans Hall.